Hello and welcome to Wildwestfaces. Today's story talks about people who were traveling out west on a wagon train. Well, three individuals were traveling with this train and were scouting ahead a little bit, and as their misfortune would have it, they ran into a band of Sioux warriors. Well, some quick thinking on their part saved their life, and while it's true they relied upon their 6 guns and their rifles to save their lives, in the end they actually owed their lives to the bullwhip. We hope you'll enjoy this exciting story of how a bullwhip saved their lives. We had accomplished about half our journey with no sign of hostile Indians. Then one day, as Simpson, George Woods, and I were riding ahead to overtake the lead train, a party of Sioux bore down on us, plainly intent on mischief. There was little time to act. No cover of any kind was to be had. For us three, even with our rifles, to have stood up against the Sioux in the open would have been suicide. Simpson had been trained to think quickly. Swinging the 3 mules so that they formed a triangle, he drew his 6-shooter and dropped them where they stood. "Now there's a little cover, boys," he said, and we all made ready for the attack. Our plan of defense was now made for us. First rifles, then at closer quarters, revolvers. If it came to a hand-to-hand conflict, we had our knives as a last resort. The Sioux drew up when they saw how quickly Simpson's wit had built a barricade for us. Then the arrows began to fly, and among them spattered a few bullets. We were as sparing as possible with our shots. Most of them hit their mark. I had already learned how to use a rifle and was glad indeed that I had. If ever a boy stood in need of that kind of preparedness, I did. Down came the Indians with the blood-curdling yell which is always a feature of their military strategy. We waited till they got well within range. Then, at Simpson's order, we fired. 3 ponies galloped riderless over the prairie, and our besiegers hesitated, then wheeled and rode out of range. But our rest was short. They came back, and again we fired and had the good fortune to stop 3 more of them. Simpson patted me encouragingly on the shoulder. "You're all right, Billy," he said, and his praise was music to my ears. By this time our poor dead mules, who had given their lives for ours, were stuck full of arrows. Woods had been winged in the shoulder. Simpson, carefully examining the wound, expressed his belief that the arrow which inflicted it had not been poisoned. But we had little time to worry about that or anything else. Our enemies were still circling, just out of range. Here and there, when they grew incautious, we dropped a man or a pony, but we were still heavily outnumbered. They knew it, and we knew it. Unless help came, it was only a question of time till it was all over. Daylight came, and they still held off. Eagerly we looked to the westward, but no wagon train appeared. We began to fear that something had happened to our friends, when suddenly one of the Indians jumped up, and with every evidence of excitement signaled to the others. In an instant they were all mounted. "They hear the crack of the bullwhip," said Woods. He was right. Without another glance in our direction, the Sioux galloped away toward the foothills, and as they disappeared, we heard the welcoming snap of the long bullwhip and saw the first of our wagons coming up the trail. In that day, however, the plainsman was delivered out of one peril only to be plunged into another. His days seldom dragged for want of excitement. William F. Cody.
In 1879, my folks came across the plains from Fort Pierre to the Black Hills, and the first town we came to of any size was Scooptown, and from there to Deadwood was mostly mountains and several toll gates. It cost $1 to go through those places. That meant the people that kept those gates kept the road repaired so it would be passable. But those roads were sure tough. I remember when we drove our team up the street of Deadwood, the mud was about 2 feet deep, and we could hardly get through, as Deadwood was one street about a mile long in a deep canyon. It was laid out in 3 sections. First Elizabethtown, Chinatown, and then Deadwood proper. We camped in Elizabethtown for several weeks and lived in a tent. It was a great sight at that time around the old Gem Theater, which was a big dance hall and gambling house. There was no law prohibiting minors from going into those places, and I sure got an eyeful. The first unusual sight I remember was seeing a woman with a black and swollen eye. And in most of those dives, there were women dealing faro bank and poker, and I was fascinated with the names they went by. There was Big Gussie, who was Bedrock Tom's common-law wife. She was considered a very capable gambler and would take and pay all bets as cool and calm as a bank teller, and just as accurate. I used to admire those old characters. There was Colorado Johnny, Tom Allen, Deaf Jimmy, and several others. I have forgotten their names. Those men were all faro dealers and wore long whiskers, and the barbers sure got well paid to keep those whiskers in perfect style. And the fine clothes and jewelry they wore must have cost a small fortune. As I remember, there was 28 legitimate faro banks in town about that time, besides several questionable ones. Those games had a limit in the amount you could bet on the turn of a card, which was usually $12.50 and $25. But 1 or 2 houses had $125 and $250 limit. That means you can only bet the low limit where there is only 1 card left in the deck to act. You can bet it to win or lose. Most everybody played faro them days, but I believe the Chinaman was the greatest gambler of them all. About 11 o'clock at night was their favorite time to start out to gamble. They would put on their best clothes, which was the very finest of goods in them days. White socks, silk top shoes, and they would leave Chinatown for the white man's game. I have seen 25 of them dressed this way, one behind the other, heading for the faro game, and they sounded like a bunch of geese honking to each other in their talk. They liked to all get around one gambling table, and if one of them seemed to be lucky, the rest of them would follow him with their bets. In fact, it seemed to be a kind of a system they had, and often they would win several $1,000s in a night. Con Price.
A man of the name of Murph Henderson lived near us on Big Creek. He was a son of Chris Henderson, who lived several years on Shoal Creek in Taney County, Missouri. One day, while the cruel war was raging, Henderson and his wife, whose name was Sarah, come to our house. Henderson was near 30 years of age. Captain Joe Smith, an old man, was also at our house at the same time Henderson and his wife was. These men were Southern sympathizers. They had not been in our house but a short time before we noticed 30 mounted men charging toward the house. A moment before they reached the yard fence, Henderson, seeing that they wore blue uniforms, darted out of the house and started running across our field. Smith made no effort to escape and remained in the house. Some of the horsemen knocked down the fence and pursued Henderson and took him in the upper part of the field and shot him to death. I was just 12 years old then and remember that awful day as if it was only yesterday. I saw them kill Henderson, and the men who remained at the house threatened to kill Smith. But I begged the men not to shoot him, that he was old and harmless, and that there was nothing alleged against him except that he held up for the southern side, and that was not a crime. I thought for a while they would kill him in spite of all my entreaties not to do so. But finally, they went away from the house without hurting Smith, and the 30 men assembled together again and rode away. Henderson's wife ran to the body of her husband first, and when the soldiers left the house, I and others went to where it lay. His head was almost shot to pieces, and the brains were spattered on the ground where the dead body lay, and Sarah Henderson, his wife, picked up all the bits of brains she could find on the ground, and those that had oozed out of the bullet holes in the head, and she wiped them off with her hands and put them all in her apron, and took them to a hollow stump which stood in a few yards of where the dead man was, and dropped them into it. A new graveyard had been started on our place, and we buried the body of Henderson there. Sarah Henderson was drowned in Big Creek a few months after the death of her man. She was mounted on a horse, or rather riding double, and was behind Bob Seipert on a stout horse, and when they reached the ford of the creek, they found that it was swollen, but Seipert told her they could ford it, and rode into the water where he soon got in where it was swimming, and the woman was drowned, and so was the horse. Seipert escaped. When the woman's body was recovered from the water, she was buried where her husband received interment. As a compliment for saving his life, Captain Smith paid me evil for good by stealing the best horse we had and fled, which he done a short while after Henderson was killed. Jim Gwen.